They say to go after what you want in life: romance, happiness, love, wealth. But sometimes chasing our dreams leads to our worst nightmares. Deadly deep dives. This video is intended for educational and documentary purposes. The content within this video contains themes that some individuals may consider triggering, offensive, or disturbing. The intent is not to disrespect viewers or any individual spoken about herein. Viewer discretion is advised. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kimbyrleigha. If you've never been here before, nice to meet you. I want to introduce you to Julie Nist. But before I do, I'd like to introduce you to her parents, Julia and John. Julie's mother's name is Julia Bowman. She was born just a couple days before Valentine's Day on February 12th, 1943, in Twin Lakes, which is an Indian reservation in New Mexico. She's part of the American Indian Navajo tribe, which is the second largest Indian nation in the United States. Back when Julia's mom was growing up, life on her reservation was not easy. There was a lack of electricity and running water, and not much to do, which led a lot of individuals down a path of alcohol and drug addiction to escape their everyday life. When Julia was 12, her parents decided to send her away. She went to a boarding school because they wanted her to learn English. This was located in Brigham City, Utah. When she got to the school, Julia started to realize that she didn't even know what the world was like beyond the reservation. Now she was free. Julia was a beautiful girl. She had dark, long hair and gorgeous almond-shaped eyes. She'd also been very confident and independent. And as she spent more time away from her family and away from the reservation, the more she decided she didn't want to go back. It would be a couple more years before Julia was brave enough to tell her parents how she was feeling and that she wouldn't be coming back. However, instead of abandoning her education, she decided to just transfer to another Indian American school in Nevada. She loved it, and when she was 16, she started working as a nanny, which opened up her world even more. The family she worked for would take trips and she would accompany them so that she could help with their children. One summer, she actually went to San Francisco, and while she was there, she was introduced to big city life. She'd never seen anything like it before. The traffic, the people, the noises of a city, the big skyscrapers. Everything was brand new, and it opened up this door of so many more possibilities. She wanted to explore, so she decided to move to Colorado Springs. As soon as Julia moved to Colorado Springs, she started working as a nurse's aide. This was at a facility for the mentally ill. Julia was perfect for this job. She was very friendly, she liked to socialize, and Colorado Springs itself was perfect because they had an active nightlife and she would be going out with friends all the time. There was a problem though. There was something that nobody knew about Julia. She had some demons. While she was working at the hospital, one of her coworkers, who was also a close friend, introduced her to amphetamines. The coworker seemed to always be alert, pulling double shifts, picking up extra work, yet still finding time to have the energy to party all night. Julia was curious about how in the world she was able to do that. She got up the nerve to ask, and her friend said she had the secret. She had been stealing pills from the hospital, speed pills. You want to try? Of course, Julia was naive, so she said yes. This would be the beginning of a long, bumpy road of addiction. Maybe if she could have seen her future before deciding to swallow that first pill, Julia would have made a totally different decision. If only she knew. As they say, hindsight is 20/20. She really enjoyed speed, mostly because it allowed her to stay up for days at a time. This seems like a good thing to some, but it wasn't. Even though she was awake, she was experiencing a lot of irritability. She was slowly becoming less of herself. She wasn't the Julia everyone used to know. It's usually a slow decline. It's not noticeable at first. Not only was she doing amphetamines, she also became a heavy drinker. I'm highlighting this because of what happens in the future. Julia loved the nightlife because she got a lot of attention. She looked different from everybody else. She was the only Navajo girl. This made her extremely popular in her town. One night on July 4th, 1964, while she was partying at a pub with friends, she bumped into a tall, handsome military police officer named John Scully. John was stationed at Fort Carson. He was 25 years old. He grew up in Philadelphia, and he was very different from Julia. John looked in her direction and he noticed right away her beautiful dark hair, olive skin, just an exotic beauty, and he made his way over to her to start a conversation. They really didn't have that much in common, except for the physical attraction that both of them felt instantly. John was smitten. He asked her out right away and she said yes. So they went on their first date and they hit it off. After only a few more dates, John proposed to Julia. He said the minute he saw her, he knew that he was going to marry her. It sounds like a fairy tale, right now anyway. On July 2nd, 1965, 2 days before their year anniversary of the day they met for the first time, Julia and John were married. They had a small ceremony at a Catholic church in Colorado Springs, and they realized they couldn't afford where they were living, so they moved back to Philadelphia, close to John's family. This is also when John ended up applying to the Philadelphia Police Department, and on February 6, 1966, he officially started working for the Philadelphia Police Department as a patrol officer in North Philadelphia, and it is well known for being a dangerous area. As you can imagine, this was hard on Julia. She was constantly worried, and it wasn't like today. They didn't have cell phones or a mode of communication that was readily available to keep in touch. There were times he had to rush out in the middle of his day off because he was on call and there was an emergency. But in the spring of 1967, Julia found out she was pregnant. Right away, she imagined this would change her life and put it in a new direction because she would have something to focus on at home while John was working. Julia gave birth to Julie Marie Scully on January 3rd, 1968. By the way, I will say that as the story goes on, we're going to be saying the names Julia and Julie a lot. I definitely try to keep it straight. Just know it is very hard and confusing when people have very similar names. Now they were a family. He started taking his family on fishing trips. This was a pastime that he enjoyed with his own family. As Julie grew up, she and her father built a really strong bond, and she became a very adventurous little girl who adored nature. They spent most of their time exploring the countryside and fishing in the lake. Another thing they would do that became a tradition in their family was crabbing. This was one of the activities that helped build their strong bond. However, one reason she could have enjoyed it so much was because she was constantly looking for approval and praise from her father. This will be a thread that carries through this story. Julia wasn't thrilled about these vacations after a while because she felt like a third wheel. She was bored, she was left out, and she was sitting in the trailer as they were bonding over fishing, and she just wanted to go home. It was also hard on her because she was hiding a secret from her family. They didn't know about her addiction. And as she was getting older, it was finally starting to really catch up with her. She became unpredictable and temperamental. She had been seeing several doctors, and each one of them tried their best to wean her off amphetamines, but it just wouldn't work. Sooner or later, she fell into a very deep depression and ended up trading one drug for another. She started doing heroin. She gave birth to another child, though, and his name was John Patrick Scully. He was born on November 10th, 1969. Now it was Julie's turn to find out what it felt like to be left out, because it turns out John spent most of his time with John Jr. and not Julie. It made Julie ramp up her efforts to seek the love and attention from her dad. He was working more than ever. He was hardly coming home, and even on Christmas, he had to leave. Julia was feeling abandoned. She was alone taking care of 2 children, and she felt like she was a single mother. And then something terrible happened. Julia was not paying close attention to Julie, and she was playing outside in the front yard when she walked into the street, and she was struck by a motorcyclist. And it was serious. Julie was rushed to the hospital, and there was more bad news. She suffered internal injuries, and they were major. She had to go through emergency surgery, including the removal of her spleen. But Julia was worried about something else. The doctors were injecting Julie with morphine to help with the pain, and Julie seemed to be enjoying it. Julia was terrified that this was the first step to a life of addiction for her daughter, Julie. Another tragedy happened in 1973. Julia was making efforts to stop doing speed, but it seemed like the withdrawals were too much for her, and every time that she would try to wean herself off, she fell into another deep depression. She felt so alone because she was hiding this from her family. She could hardly sleep, which was making her life harder because she was taking care of kids while she was completely exhausted and irritable and angry with a very short fuse. This mental downward spiral led to Julia taking an entire bottle of sleeping pills. When John got home, the kids were in bed, and he found Julia unconscious. Nobody expects this to happen. You cannot prepare for this. However, John was used to being in these high-stress situations, so he quickly sprang into action, saving her life. She was rushed to the hospital, and they were able to pump her stomach in time to save her. Even though Julie was young, she was still witnessing all of this. She was being brought up with a mother that was not stable. And as Julie got older, it became more and more apparent, and it was a constant battle. The downward spiral did not stop for Julia. Her family now knew her secret, and there were more and more outward signs of drug abuse. Julia began gaining excess weight. She didn't look like herself anymore, and this made her fall back into an even deeper depression. And it wasn't long until she tried to take her life again, and the same thing happened with the exact same outcome. But fortunately, they were able to save her. Both of the children wanted someone to pay them attention. Julie was impacted the most. She felt unwanted and second best to whatever her parents had going on in their lives. As a matter of fact, in 1976, on Julie's 9th birthday, her parents would prove they really did care more about their own needs and what they were going through in their life than what their child felt during a very special day. They had friends over and family, and Julie's whole world came crashing down. John was having an affair, and during Julie's birthday party, he tells everyone he has to leave, whether it was a work thing or meeting friends. I don't know, but Julia was suspicious. John had been confiding in others that it was really hard on him being with Julia. He lost interest because of her drug abuse. She wasn't the woman that he fell in love with, especially when it came to the way that she looked. It might sound superficial, but the drugs, they took a toll on her body. She lost her beautiful physique due to the excess drinking, and it was hard because he loved her so much, but from the beginning, it was that physical attraction that drew them together, and now it faded away, and so had John's loyalty. The only thing that had been holding their marriage together were their kids. He had been looking for a way out, and he found it. John said every time he came home, Julia was completely wasted, and he couldn't even talk to her about it. Not to mention the 2 times he had to save her when she took the sleeping pills. He had done all he could in his mind, and none of this excuses cheating. But if he was looking for a way out, I guess he found it. Some people want to be caught, and maybe John was one of those people. John walked out the door at the party, and Julia walked out right behind him, and as she looked, she saw John's mistress, and not only that, she saw them kissing. She's already in such a bad place in her life. I can only imagine how much worse that felt. He's doing this in public, and he wasn't worried about it. That's why it seemed to me as though he wanted to be caught. It wasn't long before John completely left. The whole family was devastated, and of course, this didn't help because Julie started sinking further and further into depression and drinking more and more. Then she started taking her sadness and anger out on the children. She would continuously try to turn them against their father. She would try to make them think that the reason John left was because of them. She would try to make them believe he didn't love them anymore, and that was not the case. This hurt Julie because she adored her father, she missed him, and she was worried that maybe she would never ever be close to him again. So this started a rebellion. Julie had always been a really good student, but her grades started to slip, and of course her father was very upset. So he decided to switch her to a private school called Holy Name in Kensington. He was hoping that Julie would do better if she had more rules and structure. She definitely wasn't getting that at home. So maybe if she got it in school, her grades would go up, and they did. She was hanging out with a better crowd, and she was doing way better, but it didn't last long. Julie was very popular, and she started skipping school. She was about to be a teenager. She was 12 years old, and she was gorgeous. She was tall. She had long, black, shiny hair, perfect skin, a big, pretty smile, and even from a young age, her beauty and her charisma were the traits that were admired most by others. Just like her mom, she stood out in a crowd in a good way. She knew she was pretty, and boys were always trying to get her attention. She was also boy crazy. A lot of girls are at that age, but she cared a lot more about boys than school, and boys were just way more interesting. Skipping school progressed into staying out late, and I mean late into the night. Her parents were worried, especially because the area they lived in was a rough one, so Julia was scared Julie would be introduced to drugs. For example, Julie was supposed to be having a sleepover, and when Julia came in to check on the girls, they were gone. And she panicked, which a parent would do. It's to be expected. So she calls 911, and eventually the police found the girls in downtown Philadelphia, which is probably very scary for a parent. The reason Julie did stuff like this is because she did not have any respect for her mom. And the arguments just got worse and worse, and it was a cycle of arguing, running away, the police picking her up. Julie's dad was absent because he was way too busy with work to care, and nothing was getting resolved. Finally, Julie couldn't handle it anymore, and she wanted to move in with her dad. Her dad was living with his girlfriend Lorelai at the time. They had a really nice house, and definitely were not used to having kids around. So they sit Julie down and they tell her the rules of the house, what they expected if she was going to live there. She had a curfew on the weeknights, and John wanted to know where she was at all times, and he was a cop. So this pretty much meant she was not going to be able to hide much from him. And like most teenagers, she butted heads with adults. In this case, it was John's girlfriend Lorelai. Julie did not want to listen. She really never had a mother figure in her life and no structure like this, so she rebelled against it. Every single time Lorelai would try to get Julie to do something, they would get into a big argument. John realized or thought it was Julia that had influenced her kids in this way and made Julie turn into this type of teenager, even though teenagers are usually like this anyway. But he decided to fight for full custody, and he ended up getting it. Julie was put into therapy because John thought that would be best so they could figure out how to curb her bad behavior and put her on a good path. Julie met with a psychiatrist to discuss her life and her childhood, and she described it to be pretty awful. We can't sit here and compare her childhood with ours or others, because if we do, we would be invalidating her personal feelings. This was the only life she knew. She knew it to be a harsh one in her perspective, so that's valid. In 1982, Julie finished middle school at Holy Name, and now her father was concerned about where she was going to go for high school. He only wanted the very best education for Julie. As a police officer, he was used to getting special treatment. He would use his status to get things in the community, so he figured, why not try it when it came to Julie's education? This wasn't Julie's idea. Julie did not want this. It was John. There was a well-known, prestigious high school in the area. It was a high school of engineering and science. It opened in 1979, and it had a path to transfer to Temple University. The high school is actually on the Temple University campus, with students taking college courses as part of their high school program. Only a couple hundred students were accepted into 9th grade every year. It was very, very hard to get in, and they all had to go through a rigorous application process and take an entrance exam. John decided to put on his entire police uniform and go down to the high school to speak with the principal. We won't know exactly what the conversation was about, but we do know that John tried to persuade the school to accept Julie. He also wanted her to be classified as a minority because of her Navajo heritage. In the fall of 1983, Julie was accepted, and John was over the moon. He had ruthlessly attempted to get her into the school, and he felt his hard work had finally paid off. Now, Julie, wanting to please her father, was just as excited, but at the same time, she was juggling her desire to have fun with friends and hang out with boys with being a serious student. You could have guessed, but partying was taking the lead. Friends said she was always partying and putting pleasure first over her schoolwork, and she was skipping school all the time, mingling with college students and the popular crowd who were always getting in trouble. And it wasn't long until John got a call from the school to discuss Julie's attendance. Saying John was pissed was an understatement. He was livid, and he was super disappointed. He felt like he tried so hard to make this work. So of course they started getting into pretty big arguments. It's hard. Parents think they know best. As parents, we want our children to live the best life possible. We've been there, we've done that, and we don't want them to go through the same struggles. Sometimes they take things for granted, and then they can't go back in time. It's understandable. Julie's 14. She was still so young, but she boldly told her father she wanted to withdraw from school. John thought this was all out of spite, because in his mind, she was doing this to him because he cheated and left his family. The truth was, Julie felt second best to Lorelai, and she felt John chose his girlfriend over her. She didn't feel loved, and she was using partying as a way out of her sadness. She liked going to parties because when she walked in, she was the center of attention. All eyes were on her. All of this attention-seeking behavior escalated once Julie was introduced to sex. This was just another tool in her arsenal that she could use to get attention from men. She began jumping from one boy to the next. She would have a long string of casual relationships. She would get into one and then get bored very easily, end it, and find another boy. From what her friends said, she always seemed to have a boyfriend, and she needed something or someone all the time. She never seemed to want to be alone. Her brother was on a completely different path. John Jr., coming from the exact same family and the same background, did not act out this way, and he ended up going into the Navy. By 1984, at 16 years old, she decided it was time to leave high school, and instead, she got a job as an administrative assistant, and she loved making her own money because she enjoyed buying clothes, jewelry, makeup. Who doesn't? What girl doesn't like that? And she was also living with friends, so she could do anything she wanted, and this seemed to work very well for her. She had everything she could possibly want except a guy. And she found one. His name was Neil Ziegler. Neil was 6 years older than Julie. He was tall, handsome, and he came from a very wealthy family in Morristown, which is one of the most affluent communities in South Jersey. Not sure if this is going to be surprising or not, but Julie and Neil end up getting married in November of 1985, just a couple months before Julie was turning 18. She didn't even tell her dad. And being with Neil gave Julie financial and emotional stability, but she still felt like she was missing out on having fun despite being in love. When John did find out about the marriage, he was actually happy because he felt like it would keep Julie on a better path. John really liked the fact that Neil's dad was a doctor and a professor, and as soon as things started to look better in John's perspective, Julie wanted out of the marriage, and he was just like, it figures. Once again, he felt like she was doing this out of spite. The marriage was annulled in 1988. Julie had nowhere to go, so she was forced to live back with her mom. And at this point, she found a job at an insurance company, and it paid very well. Julie was somewhat selfish with her money, though, and she wasn't even helping pay Julia, even though she was living under her roof as an adult. She continuously just spent her money on material things, and they began to fight. Julie moved out once again and moved into an apartment with friends. One thing was very apparent to everyone, including Julie. Everywhere she went, people, whether it was men or women, almost broke their necks to catch a glimpse of her when she walked by. She was always being asked if she was a model. She was tall, she was 5'7", she had a perfect body, very proportional, and people just thought she was stunning. Most importantly, she knew that she had a power over men, and she knew how to use it, and she loved using it. All that was on the outside. That was just Julie's shell. On the inside, she was very insecure, and she was desperately in search for love. She wanted that loyal devotion and affection and not just these casual dates, and she was determined to find a man who truly loved her and gave her exactly what she wanted. She felt like she was quite a catch and that she deserved it, and a man like this ended up finding her. Julie was used to being invited to lavish parties all the time, and on July 8th, 1989, Julie's at a fancy yacht club party. She's enjoying herself, she's drinking, she's dancing with friends, and all the while, there's a guy in the crowd that has his eyes on her, and his name was Tim Nist. Tim is captivated by Julie's beauty, and he's telling his friends, I need to go over there and talk to her. It wasn't hard because Julie was very friendly, and Tim was clearly well off. She was impressed with him. He was dressed nice, and then he asked her if she wanted to take a spin around town in his Porsche. Of course, she did not pass on that opportunity, and they ended up hanging out and talking all night. They wanted to see each other again. Tim invited her to the beach to go surfing, and they were pretty much taken with one another. Tim was responsible, he was financially stable, and he was 11 years older. That was a good thing, because like her dad said, she needed that structure to keep her on a good path. They did grow up in very opposite situations, though. Tim was the fourth child. He had 3 older sisters. They were a middle-class family. They lived near Princeton, New Jersey, and he really had no big problems growing up. He had a very close family, stay-at-home mom. His dad owned a pesticides and fertilizer business. His family instilled very good habits and manners and discipline in him. He studied engineering, he dropped out of college, and then he started his own car restoration company. Tim was a good-looking guy. He was tall, he's 6'4", with a great sense of humor. In the 1980s, he switched careers and he opened up a landscaping company. This is when his career really started to blow up and he started making a lot of money. The real estate market was at an all-time high, so people were buying homes. They were new homeowners and they wanted manicured lawns. Made sense. And he was doing this work all out of his condo. He just had one employee, which was a secretary helping him set up the appointments and managing his books and the clients. As soon as Julie came into his life, she wasn't thrilled about that part about him having a secretary. But Tim told her he wouldn't be able to run his business all on his own. I was wondering if you would call this jealousy, because as an adult, I would assume Julie would be mature enough to realize it's just an employee. However, the people we spend the most time with have a better chance of being in a relationship with us, or a closer relationship. It happens all the time. Actors end up dating each other, you know. Tim also had a lot of other women in his life. He didn't seem like he was wanting to settle down anytime soon. If he had, he would have been married already because he had been engaged several times throughout his 20s. However, Tim was spending a lot more time with Julie than anyone else, and they both had a love for ice hockey, which made going out with each other a lot of fun. They had a routine. They would go to the Jersey Devils games together, and then they would go out and party all night. The age difference never seemed to be an issue, but what was an issue was Julie's insecurity. Because her father cheated, this was always a concern. Tim, on the other hand, was not jealous, but Tim was not her boyfriend yet. Julie was putting pressure on Tim. Tim knew if he lost her, he'd probably have a hard time finding someone like her again, so he didn't want to let her go. She was so gorgeous, she had a good sense of humor, she was friendly. He couldn't help but say yes. He almost regretted it though. He had not seen all of Julie's true colors until one St. Patty's Day. Tim and Julie planned to meet up at a pub, but Julie was running a little late, and when she walked in, Tim was sitting at the bar talking to a blonde girl. Without saying one word, Julie walks up to Tim and punches him square in the face. Ultimately, this led to a black eye, and as you expected, Tim was blown away. It completely took him by surprise. It was very embarrassing. He wasn't doing anything wrong in his point of view. It was an innocent conversation to pass the time until Julie got there. Of course, he knew Julie was on her way, and he was probably going to introduce them to one another. Tim had to get Julie to chill out, but even after that, she told him, first, I'll kick her ass for talking to you, and then I'll kick her ass for being a blonde. That struck me as very odd. Why hurt someone over the way that they look? I don't know. Why did she have something against blondes? Was the woman that her dad cheated on a blonde? I don't know. But all I know is I wondered, what would that have to do with an innocent girl? There was also quite a double standard at play. Julie was someone that overtly flirted with men. She expected that to be okay with Tim. But if he stepped out of line, in her perspective, her temper would rage. There was a lot of emotional baggage there. And there were two chefs in the kitchen in their relationship. They both wanted to make the rules. Julie was 21, and ironically, she was working at a law firm doing the exact same type of work that Tim's secretary did for him, another kind of double standard. It was okay that she worked for men, and it was fine that she was a secretary, but it wasn't okay for Tim to need one. Julie would constantly tell Tim that she wasn't comfortable with it, and even made comments to the secretary. Julie was at work one day when a local newspaper called the Trentonian landed on her desk. An article that was in the newspaper caught her eye immediately, and it was an ad looking for girls that lived in the area to enter a beauty contest. Julie had stars in her eyes. She ripped it out, brought it home, showed it to Tim. Tim was a former photographer, and he got excited. There was a cash prize, as well as vacations and other perks involved. He told Julie she should enter, and he would take all of her pictures, so they wasted no time. Tim thought Julie had the perfect bikini body ever since they first met, and they went on that date surfing. He was 100% confident that she would win first prize, no doubt about it. So he took a bunch of her photos and then they submitted it to the Trentonian. I'm very familiar with this newspaper. I used to live in New Jersey. In order to sell more newspapers, they had a very clever marketing strategy, and I'm guessing their demographic was men. They had this special page 6, dedicated to swimsuit models. And I know because I was one of them. I was in pageantry for years. This is just a small caveat. And that's how I found myself in New Jersey. And this is what drew me to want to learn more about this case. It was a fun pastime for me. I learned a lot, but the newspaper was always looking for new girls. My best friend and I were approached while we were just working on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. I was selling casino memberships. I was young. I thought it would be pretty cool to be in a newspaper, but I'm telling you all of this for context. It's not a big deal. It wasn't anything to be bragging about per se, but it was fun. Julie didn't just see it as fun though. She really thought this was her chance. She could probably use this to catapult herself into a career in modeling. Julie hadn't heard a response though, and it had already been a week. And maybe she was in a bad mood. But all we know is that Tim walked into his office to find his secretary was gone. The phones were ringing off the hook. He didn't know what was going on. And then Julie just strolls out and takes a seat at the secretary's desk. And of course, Tim's confused. He asks, what's going on? Julie, she's got a big smile. And she says, I guess she just left. But Tim wasn't an idiot. He knew Julie. He knew that she must have made that poor girl feel so bad that she walked out, because it was clear from the beginning Julie was trying to sabotage the professional relationship between Tim and his secretary. All the attention had to be on Julie and Julie alone. Tim could not run his business alone, and Julie knew that. So she gave him pretty much no choice but to let her run his business. She quit the law firm and then came into Tim's office and reworked all of the processes that were already in place. And she sort of took control of everything. This wasn't a bad thing. Tim was old school. He was still working off paper ledgers, and Julie transitioned everything onto a computer. The thing was, when you gave her an inch, she would take a mile, and she knew she had Tim wrapped around her finger. He gave her so much freedom, and she loved that because she could go out and party, do whatever she wanted, and Tim would never give her a hard time about it. She had been working at Tim's for a couple months, and she was opening the mail every day. She still had not heard back from the newspaper. She was pissed. Instead of realizing that maybe she didn't make the cut, she decided to go down to their office to question them about why she hadn't been given a response. I guess some people can look at this as being persistent, and I know persistence can pay off, but then some people may look at it a little bit differently. Maybe she just didn't get what she wanted, and she thought she deserved it, and you could call it entitlement, but I'm not sure. She shows up, she barges in, she demands to talk to the editor, and the editor didn't even know her. They get hundreds of random entries from girls all over New Jersey. When she gets to see him, her exact words were, "Yo, what gives? Why isn't my picture in the newspaper?" The editor was shocked. This is not something he saw every day. He actually had never had this happen before. He did give Julie a chance to speak, and I don't know what they talked about, but she did end up getting accepted into the beauty pageant and would also be featured on page 6 of the Trentonian. Julie couldn't hold back her excitement about what she had accomplished, so she announced it to all of her friends and to Tim, and they started preparing for the competition. You're going to find that the competition didn't go as Julie planned. It was only the second time that the Trentonian even held one of these beauty contests. And just so you're aware, all these contests are just for publicity. They're for marketing and finding more models for their newspaper. They would make girls like me when I was 18 feel special. Then they knew you were more likely to want to participate in more and more. They would give you gifts, hotel stays, VIP clubs. They even drove me around in a limo. Some refer to this as grooming, and one reason why is because they would also introduce you to high rollers, and those high rollers would want a female companion, and they would even hand us their room keys. I think you know where I'm going with this. Being in this contest, in my perspective, isn't that big of an ordeal. There were only 12 girls that were named as finalists, and they were competing for a trip to California as well as, get this, a chance. And this is what I'm talking about with the way that these beauty pageants go. A chance to enter another bikini contest. Wow. That's what you're getting when you're winning. A trip to California and a chance to enter another contest. Well, there were a couple hundred people that came to the Marriott, so that's a pretty big crowd. And they were there to watch the women, mostly men in the crowd. Do I think these contests are rigged? Yes, I do. But that could also just be a conspiracy theory. I don't know. What I do know is that Julie was very confident she was going to win, because just a few weeks ago, her picture appeared in the Trentonian page 6 as promised by the editor. She definitely thought that was going to give her a leg up in the competition. There she was, 5'7", and one of her most prominent attributes, and this is from what I read, so I had to mention it, was her large chest. That got her a lot of attention, and she knew how to show it off in the right way. This wasn't just a beauty contest. This was something she thought was going to completely change her life. All eyes were on her. This is what she always dreamed of. Just keep that in mind. Ever since she found out that the editor was going to let her compete, she spent so much time buying swimsuits, trying them on for Tim, posing, to make sure she had the right stance as well as the perfect look for this competition. She was practicing anytime she had free time. She took this very seriously. She learned how to walk down the runway and answer questions, because if you didn't know, they ask you all these silly questions. I'm going to show you one from a long time ago. You might remember.
Recent polls have shown a fifth of Americans can't locate the U.S. on a world map. Why do you think this is?
I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps, and I believe that our education, like such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere like such as, and I believe that they should, our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. or should help South Africa and should help the Iraq and the Asian countries, so we will be able to build up our future for our children.
Thank you very much, South Carolina.
Okay, does that bring back memories for you? Because, oh my God, I was so embarrassed for that poor girl. I'll never forget that clip. So this is what they call the personality phase, where you get to answer some questions so that the judges know you're not just a pretty face, so to speak. And this is where the whole thing about the large chest comes in. She asked him, what are 3 words that you would use to describe me? Because that was one of the previous year's questions. And he literally said, quote, skinny, big tits. That's what he said. So the girls, they're gathered on stage, and they would take their turn standing in front of the judges, and Julie didn't go till the end, and maybe they were saving the best for last. I'm sure that's what she thought anyway. You know what these beauty pageants are like, and if you don't, you've got the bikini-clad women, usually very tan, either spray tanned or back then from using tanning beds. But I don't want you to think this is easy, because it's not. It's pretty nerve-wracking. The crowd is filled with all these men. They're catcalling you. They're screaming to get your attention because they think after you walk off stage, you're going to give them a chance. That's also why the judges want to be part of these competitions most times. Unfortunately for Julie, only one of the judges chose her to be a winner. All of the other judges did not agree, and she did not even place in the competition. Not only did she feel defeated, she was angry, and as soon as she walked off that stage, she went right to Tim and she told him that she was way prettier than the girl that won. All she got to take home were some measly vouchers for a store nearby, and that's pretty harsh in my opinion. It's like, here's a voucher for your time. Because I told you these things are pretty much a joke. They really are. While she's at the competition, she meets another model. Her name is Cheryl Chupless. They ended up becoming really good friends. Cheryl's talking to another editor of the Trentonian, and he's responsible for hiring promotional models. The editor's name was Gail Baldwin, and he knew he didn't have anyone on his roster that looked like Julie. He was talking to her, and she was eating this up. She was so happy that people were giving her this attention. She was on top of the world in that moment, knowing, okay, I didn't win this competition, but I just made 2 solid connections. They would be hired to go to places like bars and get the crowds hyped up on one of the newest drinks. They would hand out samples for the patrons to test out, and 9 times out of 10, it's usually an alcohol company. So Gail hires both Cheryl and Julie to become one of the new promo girls, and what's funny is when they said that Cheryl and her became really good friends, I laughed because Cheryl was a blonde. Just throwing that out there because you remember what happened at the pub on that St. Patty's Day with the other blonde. I guess as long as you don't flirt with her man, she's fine with you being a blonde, and that's good because I didn't want someone else to get punched in the face. Julie got her first promo job in the summer, and she was sent out to a few bars and a nightclub to promote a company called Hub City Beer. She did such a good job, and her and Cheryl were like a tag team. They had such good chemistry that they started sending them out with each other time and time again, and they were working a few nights a week. Ultimately, they got hired for gigs for Miller Brewing Company and Coors Light. They were going all over South Jersey Shore doing these promotions. And for Julie, it was second nature. She had a very extroverted personality. She loved talking to people. She would go right up to them. She wouldn't just do the promotion. She would stay afterwards, and men would buy her drinks, and her and Cheryl would just party it up. They became very popular in the local nightclub scene. They were actually handing out their schedules so that mostly guys would know where they would be on any given night. There were baseball players that were even following them from bar to bar during the week. All the while, Julie is still working her full-time job at her boyfriend Tim's landscaping company. Although Tim was proud of all her accomplishments, he never went to any of the events. He didn't get involved. He didn't go to her modeling shoots or the nightclub appearances. He was a homebody, completely opposite of Julie. Tim loved to spend time at home with his dog, and I'm the exact same way, so I can totally relate. The more promo work she did, the more modeling jobs she was getting. And ultimately, she has this big surprise for her mom. They're driving in the car together, and she says, "Mom, look." And she's on a huge billboard right over the highway in her bikini. And this was an ad for guess who? The Trentonian. It gave her a lot of exposure, and it helped her get even more modeling gigs. The modeling gigs were paying off for Julie, and they were also paying off for the Trentonian because their sales kept going up. Right after adding these women to the papers, they noticed a really steep increase. Probably because, like I said, their demographic is men. Julie was becoming a local celebrity. Everywhere she went, people would recognize her. I'm sure it made you feel pretty famous because you're in this bubble where everybody knows who you are. And she was being invited to all kinds of new events and fundraisers and rubbing elbows with important people. But as they say, all good things must come to an end, right? And by the fall of 1990, things were really slowing down when it came to the promotional work. Now Julie started entering even more beauty pageants because even if she didn't place, she would still win some money. And it also can be somewhat of an addiction. The rush of planning for the contest and being on stage and the anticipation of finding out if you won, and then the letdown when it's over. She did win some titles. She held the title for Miss Muscle Cars, Miss Hawaiian Tropic, Miss New Jersey, and Miss Beach Haven. She was in a really happy place at this time in her life, but there is something she wanted. She wanted Tim to take their relationship to the next level, and she was putting a lot of pressure on him to propose. Specifically, she wanted him to propose before Christmas. Oh, she had no shame. She was very persistent, and Tim even called her controlling. But he finally gave in. Just like she marched down to the newspaper, persistently asking them to put her on page 6 and then announcing it once it happened, she did the same thing once Tim proposed. She called up Cheryl to let her know right away. He proposed on Christmas morning. And just like she hadn't wasted any time preparing for the pageant, she wasted no time at all starting to plan for her wedding. This was going to be the most important day in her life. You can also imagine if she took the competitions as seriously as she did, her wedding was going to be a huge affair that no one would forget. That summer, June 12th, Julie was once again on stage at her second Trentonian swimwear contest. This time they invited all their friends to get into the crowd and cheer for Julie when she was up on stage, because maybe that would make the judges see that she was clearly who they should pick. Unfortunately, once again, Julie did not place. She did get a free bathing suit, though, and a membership to the Hillsborough Country Club for a year. She was still getting featured on page 6, though, so that's a plus. But of course, remember, this is just a big selling strategy for the Trentonian. Julie was interested in stepping up her game, so she decided to try sending out headshots all over New York in hopes of becoming a famous actress, but that didn't pan out for her either. She thought the reason she wasn't hitting it big in New York was because she was spending so much time working for Tim. She couldn't possibly give modeling all of her time if she was at the office focusing on him and his business. The thing was, she couldn't stomach the idea of Tim hiring a secretary, so she remained working there because she didn't want him to hire someone else. Tim even told her, and these were his words, "I promise I'll only hire someone big, fat, and ugly," so she didn't have to worry about anything. After all, Tim was about to marry her. Julie's big day was finally here. November 16th, 1991, she walked down the aisle in a Catholic ceremony at St. Gregory's in New Jersey. She was only 23 when her and Tim tied the knot, and she looked perfect. Cheryl was Julie's maid of honor. She helped her pick out the perfect dress. They ended up settling on a $5,000 gown that reminded them of a princess dress. Maybe you would call Julie a bridezilla, I don't know, but she was very demanding. And that every detail was just exactly the way she wanted, especially when she wanted to party longer. The venue they were having the reception at decided they were just going to close up at 10, and she was like, "No, I'm in my dress. I want to drink. I want to dance. you better open it back up. But whatever she said, it worked. Tim said she was able to get the bar back open. After the wedding, they went on a fabulous honeymoon vacation on a cruise ship to the Caribbean. They had such an amazing time that they decided they were going to make this an annual tradition. They were living very comfortably at this time. They had a combined income of close to about $200,000. This was generally more than enough for a couple to support themselves and be able to live a life free from any financial worry. And it's true. They really knew no limits of what money could do for them. They never had to worry about budgeting or spoiling themselves. And up until 1997, Julie's modeling career brought in increasingly high amounts of money. Each year, she was earning more and more. The couple were practically swimming in cash, having more than enough for anything that they needed. Julie did not settle down after they got married. She was busier than she had ever been. She was going to gigs all over Jersey and beyond. But there was one thing that she was spending even more time on, and that was finding the perfect house, and not just any house. Julie wanted a house in a very nice neighborhood. They finally found one in Mansfield Township. This is a very affluent area. It's in the middle of Philadelphia and New York. She thought this would give her an opportunity to do more modeling gigs. In the fall of 1992, they finally moved into their house, and she did not spare a second renovating the entire house to suit her taste. Julie seemed to have it all from the outside, but there was something Julie wasn't able to accomplish. She had never placed in the Trentonian beauty contest, and this was her third time trying. She dedicated months at this point because she really wanted to place this time. And she got lucky. She came in second place, and she won $500 and a trip to Jamaica. The next step was the big screen. Not exactly, but she did find herself on TV. There was a lot of controversy going on regarding Trentonian's Page 6. This eventually landed Julie on the Maury Povich show. This is a talk show. You probably know which one it is. The Trentonian decides to send Julie as their spokesperson, and maybe it's because she knew the most about the newspaper. She had been posing for Page 6 for a long time. Julie was also very well spoken. She was educated, beautiful, and seemed perfect to represent them and defend the newspaper. There were activists, there were women's rights groups that were saying that this newspaper exploits women. And Julie just said, you know what? It's fun. That's all you need to worry about. And then in a bold move, she strips down to her bikini on stage for shock value. She was pretty much like, hey, this is it. This is what you see. Is this bad? And it's funny how much things have changed, because when I was reading this, I was thinking about music videos nowadays. It is so normalized. But I guess back then, it was a big deal to have bikini-clad women in newspapers. There was also something else Julie continued to do. Not only was she continuing to do the pageants, but she was continuing to party a lot while Tim was hanging out at home. This led Tim and Julie to spend less and less time together. They started to form totally different groups of friends, and Julie just wanted more independence. Her friends mentioned how it seemed like they were living two separate lives and they were distant from one another. Julie did feel insecure after she heard that, and she was wondering if Tim even loved her. They wouldn't hug, they wouldn't touch when they were together, and they hardly had sex anymore. Julie just didn't feel like doing it. They had even gotten into several arguments about it. Sometimes they would get in fights that would make them go into the silent treatment with each other for weeks. Julie bought a video camera, an 8mm video camera, and she actually became somewhat of a vlogger before YouTube and all that was invented. But she would turn the video camera on herself and talk about her day. So she would do day in the life videos. Now, she wouldn't post them anywhere like we do now, but she loved to showcase what she was doing, like going to crabbing or fishing and just showcasing her hobbies. And there was one she also captured a lot of, and that was her hobby of excessively drinking. Julie started to confide in one of her and Tim's mutual friends. His name is Tony Capella. She would tell him about their relationship and her dreams and what she wanted to do in life, and they became very close. He would give her advice and try to persuade her to stop partying so much and pay attention to your relationship. He also didn't like going to parties with her because he wasn't comfortable with some of the party favors that she enjoyed doing. But there were times that Tim and Julie would hang out. They would go on double dates with another couple named Mark and Tracy. The first time Julie met Tracy, she walked right up and said, quote, "Yo, I'm Julie. Who are you?" And at first, Tracy was very uncomfortable. It threw her for a loop. But eventually, she came to understand this is just Julie's way. She was a girl from Philly. And she had that kind of abrasive exterior. But sooner or later, Tracy learned that Julie was very kind. And they got along really well and became very good friends. But her friends noticed she wasn't just addicted to drinking and going out. She was also addicted to attention itself. And what I mean by that was everyone around her would notice when she went out partying, she would come alive. And once she came home and back down to earth, she got sad. It was actually like withdrawal symptoms. She would be looking for the next exciting thing to give her that rush. It was 1994. Her family was thinking she needed to add something to her life. Remember when Julia was alone, when John was working? She felt like she needed a new purpose, and of course, Julia wanted a grandchild, so she tried to convince Tim and Julie to have a baby. They had enough money coming in, so they thought this was probably a good time to try. But Julie was really scared of something. She thought the pregnancy would ruin her body. Then she would have to give up all of her dreams and all of the opportunities. But it happened in February 1995. She got pregnant. Julie was excited. She told everyone Tim wanted to be a dad so bad. The pregnancy was actually helping them bond again. They felt more connected than ever. When Julie was 5 months pregnant, she was ready to show off that baby bump. She threw a big party for the summer. She had a Hawaiian luau, and she wore a one-piece bikini swimsuit with a thong. Now, the thing that people notice at this party, and you can take it any way you want, it's her body, her choices, I guess. She never stopped drinking or smoking while she was pregnant. Her friends said they felt very uncomfortable and they would tell her, but she wouldn't listen to them. You couldn't control what she did. You would get into a fight, so most people would just bite their tongue. Not only did she not like the fact that people were trying to control her, she didn't like the fact she didn't have control over her own body. She was starting to gain weight, which is to be expected in pregnancy, but it made her depressed. Oh, and don't get me started on the way that she would react if someone pointed out her belly. Remember, she was popular in town, and of course people would say something like, "Oh wow, your big belly." It wasn't intended to be an insult, but Julie took it that way. She would go off on strangers left, right, and center. And no, it wasn't just yelling. She actually punched a man in the face. In the face. November 26th, 1996, Julie gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Katie Scarlett Nist. This might be a surprise or maybe not, but after Katie was born, Julie did change. She loved being a mom. It does that to a lot of people. You want to shut everything off and spend all of your time on this little human being. She was no longer turning the camera on herself in her own videos. She was turning it on Katie, talking about how cute she was. Her mother, Julia, was coming over more than ever to help her with little Katie. Anytime Julie needed something or to go out, Julia was there to babysit. Don't think this didn't cause problems. Julie and Julia fought all the time about the way Katie was going to be raised. Sometimes it would get so bad she would tell her mother to leave and never come back. They wouldn't see each other for a while until Julie needed her again. One reason behind these arguments was resentment, because now that Julie was a mom, she wanted to give her child the best life possible. She started to think about her own childhood. She got pretty upset when she realized, if you love a child so much, how in the world could you treat them the way that her parents did? Just the fact that her father would leave like that. Did they even love her? Just like her mother had in the past, Julie started to fall into a deep depression. Tim and everyone close to her, they tried again and again to have her snap out of it, but she couldn't. The pregnancy pounds were also a big source of insecurity. They just would not come off. She still had an extra 35 pounds that she had gained during her pregnancy, but she wasn't making an attempt to do anything about it. Maybe it was the depression. She wouldn't work out and she couldn't get out of bed, so then she was depressed and it was a vicious cycle. When she looked at her body, it made her miss the times that she was free to do whatever she wanted. Now, I'm glad this next thing happened because it did bring some clarity to what was going on. Julie was finally diagnosed with postpartum depression. Her doctor ended up prescribing her medications, and it did help. Though Julie had good intentions at times, she was still selfish. It was hard for her to split her time between the things she wanted to do and being there for her family. And it caused problems in her relationship. And finally, April 1997, Tim and Julie decide they need to go to marriage counseling. Tim knew their relationship was not going to mend itself. It wasn't working. But the counseling did not work because even though the therapist was supposed to be impartial, Julie felt as though the therapist was siding with Tim. The truth is, the therapist was digging deep into Julie's past and figuring out that a lot of the problems stemmed from things that she really needed to work out from her childhood. But Julie didn't feel comfortable with that. She decided couples counseling was not for her. Besides, Julie had her own therapist. Her therapist said that the marriage was falling apart because of Tim. It was his fault. He wasn't giving her enough attention and affection, and he didn't see things Julie's way. He didn't socialize the way that she did, and they were just growing apart. Julie decided she was probably going to leave him. It was like something just flipped in her. And then she just considered herself single again. She started partying really hard. She would be coming home drunk and high. She was doing a lot of cocaine. She would show up at events, like a black tie event that one of her friends had, and in the middle of the meal, she would just leave. And later they would find out she was downtown scoring cocaine and partying all night, and that would hurt her friends. This especially hurt Julie's mom. Because remember, Julia was always afraid that Julie was going to go down the same path when it came to drugs. And when Julia found a rolled up $20 bill when she was doing laundry at Julie's house, she freaked out. She was taking Prozac with cocaine, and then she was drinking. They had this perfect life, and Tim kept telling her, if you can't be happy with everything that you have right now, a loving family, a mom who cares about you and your daughter and wants to help you, what's going to make you happy? What more do you want? They decided that maybe they could rekindle the romance by going on a cruise. They planned one for November, and remember, this was an annual tradition. They usually went every January to start the year off right. This time they said, let's do it earlier as a Christmas gift to ourselves. They booked a week-long cruise on Celebrity Cruise Line on a brand new ship called the Galaxy. It had everything. It was super luxurious. Casino, a nightclub, a theater. They left on Saturday, November 1st. They flew to San Juan, Puerto Rico to board the ship. On the first night, when Tim headed back to the room to watch the hockey game, Julie was bored. So being Julie, she hit up the casino, and as she was walking down the corridor, she caught the eye of a man named George Skiadopoulos. We're going to be calling him by his first name, George. He was one of the engineers on the Galaxy. It might sound impressive, but it was the lowest officer position in the engineering department. The most significant responsibility that George had was to safely and effectively perform lookouts on certain parts of the ship. But his uniform made him look very official and important. Julie was dressed up. She was wearing a low-cut dress. George took a mental note, thinking he had to introduce himself if he saw her again. The next morning, he got his chance. The ship docked on a beach in the Dominican Republic, and Julie decided to go swimming. She was lying on a raft in her bikini while Tim was relaxing on the shore. George had a day off. He was allowed to spend time at the same beach, and he spotted Julie. She definitely wasn't hard to miss. He told his fellow crewmates she was the most beautiful girl on the cruise ship, and he made a bet that he would be able to get her to come back to his cabin. George was only 22 years old. This is a young guy. He's just starting his career. He graduated from high school not too long ago. Someone like me, I wouldn't know what a third engineer meant. If you told me you worked on the cruise ship and you were wearing a nice uniform, I would probably believe you were the captain for all I know. George wastes no time. He goes right up to Julie, introduces himself, and sort of makes her believe he's in a higher position than he was on the ship. Julie's excited. She's thinking, okay, he's going to be able to get me into swanky VIP parties, and she connects with people all the time. So this is what she does. She didn't think anything more of it. Whereas a man might be thinking, she's giving me attention. She's flirting with me. She's interested. I have a chance. no. At this point, Julie wants to get something. She's thinking, how can she achieve her goal by connecting with George? Tim's not the jealous type, we know that. He's used to seeing Julie talk to people all the time. This was no different. He had looked over and he saw them talking. He didn't even give it a second thought. As a matter of fact, when he first saw George, he thought, oh, I wonder who that prematurely bald-looking dude with the really bad teeth talking to Julie is. George has a really thick accent. He tells Julie he's Greek. She told him she was a model, and he said he could have guessed. And they were kind of bragging about their accomplishments, and he lies and tells her he's 28. At this point, Julie waves to Tim, and she tells George, that's my husband. He takes that as a signal that he should come down the beach and introduce himself. And the first thing that Tim says, finding out that George works on the ship, is kind of the same thing Julie was expecting. Can you get us any perks? The best that George could offer at that time was to give them a tour of the engine room, but they thought that was cool. They would have something special that most people don't get to see, but today was not the day. They finished their conversation and they went their separate ways, not really planning anything concrete, just saying, we might see each other around. The next morning, though, they get a call from George asking how everything was going. It was a little odd. They had been on cruise ships before. They really were not ever called that way, but he was friendly. They did ask to be taken on a tour of the engine room, so they thought nothing of it. What Julie might not have noticed is that they kept bumping into each other. It wasn't a coincidence, especially because if Tim was with Julie, then George would not stop and talk to her. But if she was alone, they would chat it up. Julie told Tim she was the happiest she'd been in a long time. She told him she knew this was going to bring back the romance in their relationship. The last night of their trip, they get another call from George. And this time he says, I'll take you to the engine room. They meet up. He invites them inside, takes them around. Julie gets pictures, and all the while he's breaking the rules. But this does seem to impress them. This was the very last time they would probably see George. Tim thought it would be nice to have a connection on Celebrity Cruise Line, so he told Julie to get George's information to keep in touch. They exchanged addresses. However, there was something happening. There seemed to be an instant chemistry between George and Julie. It wouldn't be evident to anyone on the outside, but she had to tell someone. So when she returned home, she called up Tony, and she made him swear he wouldn't say anything, but she needed to get something off her chest. She talked about how she met George and felt something different. She said it was probably nothing, but she definitely felt a physical attraction. Of course, Tony doesn't take it seriously. He said, listen, you're never going to see this guy again. He lives in Greece. Who cares? He tells her she didn't do anything wrong and just let it go. After she settled back in, she's focusing on what's important. Her husband and daughter, the two people she loved the most in her life. However, she's still feeling empty from her marriage. The cruise really didn't do much. It was a temporary fix, and she wasn't feeling as pretty as she did before. She wasn't getting the same attention from Tim. She would remember the way that she felt when George first met her. He went out of his way to talk to her. Maybe that's why she felt attracted to him. She truly loved feeling like she was someone special. Even though she knew she was attractive enough to appear on magazines and billboards, it still seemed like Julie couldn't get the attention that she was used to, and as much as she loved him, it seemed as though he could never satisfy the craving that she had to be on the top of a pedestal. The thing I was thinking, though, is that Tim did everything for her. He loved her. He supported her. He let her into his life, his business, but it was never enough. She just almost saw it as a burden. Julie was bored. She was getting ready to turn 30, and she started thinking about her life. She was beginning to feel like she wasn't getting what she wanted out of the marriage. She started thinking about George, and she started thinking he had the qualities that she was looking for. He was exciting, but soon enough, Julie and Tim, they went back to their everyday life and their daily routines, and Julie was continuing to keep everything inside. Their life was falling back into place until George started to contact Julie. It began with a nice letter to say that he hoped the couple had enjoyed the cruise, and if they ever needed anything on their next trip, just let him know. Then it became more intense. This was George's plan. It went from letters to talking on the phone, and soon enough, They were in contact every single day. One of George's main goals was to convince Julie that Tim wasn't good enough for her. And he made himself out to look like this perfect guy that was going to treat her better. She wasn't exactly keeping these phone calls a secret from Tim because he had caught her several times talking in very hushed tones over the phone. And on one occasion, or several actually, he would pick up the phone, know it was George, and then just say, "Hey, here, Julie. George wants to talk to you," and thought nothing of it. Months went by. Julie pretended nothing had changed, but the act could only go on so long. George and Julie were confiding in one another. Julie was finding out so much about George, and the more she found out about him, the more she realized that they had a lot more in common than her and Tim, or so she thought. George was ambitious. He came from a hardworking family in Greece in a small fishing town. Remember Julie's love for fishing, which Tim didn't exactly share. But the big thing that they had in common was that both of their fathers cheated. George was raised by his mom and his grandma. When he was 14 years old, his dad cheated while his mother was pregnant with his little brother. And then his father left to go live with his mistress. It was traumatizing for George, and Julie could relate. Throughout his whole childhood, he had this obsession about escaping to another world, and he had this love for the ocean. He would sit and stare at the ocean and dream of escaping this small village and going on vacations all over the world. And that's what drew him into wanting to work on cruise ships. Just like Julie, growing up, George was attractive and popular, and he was a really good student, but he was also somewhat of a recluse, and not many people were close to him. So you can see how George and Julie would bond. She's always dated older guys. Now she's getting the attention of a younger guy as she's getting older. This might have been exciting, even though Julie was keeping this a secret. They ended up having an amazing Christmas as a family. It was Katie's very first one, and Tim went out of his way to make it memorable. He even had someone dress up as Santa Claus and then come over to the house and give gifts to everyone. Sadly, Julie was just not present. She was off in her own head, and now her daughter was the center of attention. Julia did not think that Julie was giving Katie her all. She wanted her to be an attentive mother. She wanted her to pay attention in the moment. So they would go back and forth with these fights with her mom, coming back and forth and in and out of her life. So on January 3rd, 1998, Tim decides to throw her a surprise party for her 30th, hoping to bring her spirits up, bring her back down to earth, have a little fun. He gets all of her friends together, and he's right. It's a really happy time. They had a lot of fun. And later, Julie says she wants one more gift for her birthday. She wants to take another cruise. Tim didn't really have to be convinced. This was a tradition, so he asked, "Where are we going this time?" This is when Tim got confused. He was expecting a different ship, a different destination, but Julie insists they go on the same ship to the same place, and Tim is standing there bewildered and asking why. Of course, he didn't want to upset her because she was up and down with her depression, so he's like, okay, why not? We know the real reason that she wants to go back on the ship. It's pretty obvious. I'm surprised it wasn't clear to Tim, but she wants to test her attraction to George. She wants to know if she sees him again, is she going to feel the same? Or is this going to fade? Is it just some kind of fantasy? Or is there something more? Friday, February 13th, Julie and Tim went back to San Juan and get on their cruise once again. And guess who's there to greet them? George. This time, George was bombarding them more than last time. He was always calling, always trying to meet up with them. Tim was getting annoyed, especially because they were on the exact same cruise, on the exact same islands, doing the exact same thing. He was bored out of his mind. There might have been a little suspicion coming from Tim because one night they get into a fight. Julie had met some girls on the cruise and she wanted to go out. I don't know if she asked him to accompany her or not, but she tells Tim that George is going to come. He just says, go on and go, and he stays behind to go to bed. This is when that little bet that George made with his crewmates comes into action. Julie gets obliterated, crying in George's arms, explaining how she feels trapped in her marriage, and he pulls the biggest trick in the book. He says, let's go and talk in my cabin. Cha-ching, money in his hand, he knew it. There in his cabin, he's showering her with compliments, telling her how beautiful she is, how much he loved her. He loves her. This is only the second time that they've seen each other. At first, Julie was a little timid. She was standoffish. Although she was vulnerable in that moment, she did not want to be disloyal. I mean, this is what her dad did. This is what George's dad did. What hypocrites. She fell for it with her husband just down the hall. She fell for it. Not only did they kiss, they had sex. In that moment, it was something that Julie couldn't describe. When she tried to explain it later to friends, she just told them there was this passion there. She couldn't figure out why. She knew that she had this intense feeling of what seemed like love, but it wasn't clear why a gorgeous woman with a successful career and a life that anyone would be jealous of would think about trading it for this young man with practically nothing to offer. Why was Julie so attracted to him? Was it the attention that he was giving her? He seemed desperate to do anything she wanted because he wanted her to stick around. That night, she returned to her cabin and she snuck back in, being as quiet as possible, and she climbed right into bed with Tim. And all the while, she's got this secret burning inside of her. She couldn't sleep because all night, she was just thinking about George. She knew this is what she wanted. She wanted to be with him. Poor Tim, he has no idea that any of this is going on. When they return home, she's actually in a really good mood. And once again, he's thinking it's the cruise. Every time they go on a cruise, she's happy again. When she tells her friend Cheryl about George, she can't believe it. Julie had this arrogant attitude too. She's like, listen, F Tim. I met someone else. I'm not going to let Tim hurt me anymore. And I'm sitting here thinking, what was Tim doing wrong? I mean, I don't know him personally and I can't get right into the relationship. But what was Tim not doing enough of? Now, this gave Julie the determination to get in the best shape of her life for George. She wanted to feel confident again and live a new life. Now when Tony found out, remember, he didn't think anything of it. And he was friends with Tim, even though he was a confidant for Julie. He did not agree with this relationship. He was not okay keeping secrets. He was also Katie's godfather, so he felt very uncomfortable with the fact that he would have to keep this secret from a little girl whose mother was doing the exact thing that her father did. When Tony asked how far it went, Julie actually told him the truth, and he was even more upset. He told Julie, I can't talk about this anymore. And then he reminded her about her past. Now Katie was going to have to go through that same thing. She pretty much lost Tony as a friend at this point because he couldn't keep those secrets. He couldn't have it on his conscience. Tony told people everything was about Julie all the time, and she decided she was going to have a little trip of her own, all about herself and her happiness. So she returned to San Juan secretly to hook up with George. She had this master plan. She took Katie and her mom to go visit her brother in Florida. It wasn't too far from Puerto Rico. She ends up admitting everything to Julia on the trip. Can you believe that? After Julia was cheated on, Julie let her mom in on all of her secrets. When her mom asked how far it went, Julie lied. Either way, Julia was upset. She said, it's not okay. You have Katie. This is stupid. It's going to lead to something really bad and you're going to regret it. On March 26, 1998, after flying to Florida, she gets up the very next morning and goes straight to Puerto Rico to meet up with George. They had a day of complete adultery. Not only that, they started to talk about what they were going to do next. Now, we're not going to know exactly what they talked about. I don't know whether George wanted her to break up with Tim or not. It didn't matter. He was involved in breaking up this marriage and tearing it apart, whether he wanted to or not. To me, actions speak louder than words. When she got back home, she still talked to George nonstop, and it was getting more and more frequent. She was taking more risks, and she was writing these love letters and kissing them with red lipstick. I mean, Tim could have seen them at any moment. She even started recording home videos for George to watch. All the while, she is living off of Tim's salary. She's going on shopping sprees and doing whatever she wanted. In her mind, she was single again. She was going out partying and doing a lot more cocaine. She wanted to see George more and more, but Julia forbid it. She said she wasn't going to watch Katie in order for her to go cheat on her husband. She was giving less and less attention to Tim, and now, being married for 7 years, they had to figure out what was wrong, so they go back to counseling. During the very first meeting, Julie looks over at Tim, and she says, I want a separation. Tim says, no, we're getting a divorce. The counselor was trying to mediate it and trying to find some middle ground, but Tim said he doesn't believe in that. It's either we're on or we're off. We're together or we're not. So Tim decides he's going to leave. He moves out, and they're going to figure out what they're going to do next. Julie was once again controlling the situation and getting exactly what she wanted. The thing she didn't get was the access to the money. She had to do everything herself. If she was going to leave the marriage, she had to be independent. Remember, though, they're running this business together. She still had a stake in it. She was still doing her part for Sterling Lawns. She was also acting like a young and free woman and going through somewhat of a midlife crisis. George tells her, "You need to move to Greece so that we can be together." And all the while, Tim has no say in any of this. She figures she's just going to leave with Katie, say goodbye, all for this young Greek sailor. She definitely wasn't thinking clearly. It's hard to believe that she would actually be in such a different state of mind that she thought this was acceptable. Was it the drugs? Was it the lust? As they say, love is blind. Even her friends, they thought, okay, she's going to snap out of it at any moment. It's just a phase, right? Tim's father, he had warned him about going into business with Julie. Sterling Lawns was now $1 million company, and Julie wanted her share. She needed some money because she was planning to move to Greece with Katie now, so she needed to save up. Don't think Julie didn't think about what it would be like leaving the life that she had, though, especially without knowing if life with George would be better. She did have this nagging feeling that she needed to get to know George just a little bit more before she picked up her entire life and moved to another country. He was so persistent, though. One time he writes this letter to her, and in the letter, he's trying to convince her that when people are trying to make a really big decision, they have all this fear inside. But what they really need to do is trust their feelings and not facts, basically. This was very manipulating because we all know feelings, they come, they go, they're up, they're down, especially when you're dealing with an emotionally unstable person to begin with. This is also when George told Julie some upsetting news. He had to serve a mandatory 20-month military service. It was required for every Greek man, and there was no way out of it. It had just been looming over his head. Julie was so worried. She felt like if she didn't see him soon, he was going to slip away. They tried to concoct a plan at first where he could get a visa and then come live in New Jersey and hide out, or just escape and lie and avoid the military, but they knew in reality that wasn't going to work. For some reason, she ends up telling George that she's taking Prozac and other prescription drugs to help with her mood swings, and George kind of goes ballistic. He tells her he doesn't believe in medication and she needs to get rid of them right away. This was more manipulation. If she wasn't stable, then she could easily be taken advantage of more and more. Like her own mother, Julie traded one drug for another. She was going hard with cocaine. She was up at all hours of the night, obsessively faxing George. That's how they were keeping in contact. And not only was she taking cocaine, but she was taking sleeping pills. So cocaine to stay awake, sleeping pills to go to sleep, while working out constantly. And by the summer, she had lost at least 20 pounds. Now she wanted to get back into modeling. She was finally ready to get some gigs, make some more cash. But do you think George was going to let that happen? No. This wasn't Tim we're talking about. This is a 22-year-old boy. He was extremely jealous, and he didn't want her to do it. She had already booked several gigs. She had been planning this. He told her it was inappropriate for her to be going to bars and doing these promotions with these men. Even though she tried to convince him, it's innocent, it's just a job. He demanded she quit immediately. Just like that, she started canceling all of her modeling gigs, and Cheryl, who had done so much modeling with her, was confused, and she confronted her. She said it was very unprofessional and it was frustrating because they used to be a team. She was yelling at Julie saying, "You're worried about some guy on a cruise ship. You're caring what he thinks about? Tim never stopped you from doing this. I can't believe you're letting him tell you what to do." Julie was losing all of her friends. She tried to confide in George, and he would tell her, "You're better off not having these friends. Just cut them off." This was another way for him to gain power. On July 16th, Tim had to do some work at his office. He needed to go inside their home to access business documents. And to his surprise, he was locked out. And there was a big sign on the door that Julie had written, and it said, "Do not enter." Tim realized, this is going to affect my business. So he had no choice but to call the police. I'm only telling you this part because I want to show you the state of mind where Julie was with her state of mind. She was livid. She was arguing with police. It wasn't until her attorney came to the house that she was able to calm down, and it was possible to get Tim into the home so he could remove all his files and move into a new office. Not only that, Julie became paranoid. She thought that people were spying on her and that Tim was hiring them to follow her around. The people around her said she became delusional. She didn't trust her friends, anyone in her life, and especially not strangers. She thought everyone was working for Tim. She was trapped. She would not even leave her house. She did not see that this relationship with George was toxic. By the middle of the summer, George and Julie got engaged. They didn't tell anyone though. She was 100% serious at this point about moving to Greece. She was going to do it in the new year. She started telling her friends that George was her future husband and that she was going to be planning their wedding. But then her friends wanted to see the engagement ring. And it might sound shallow, but they were shocked. She had replaced her big diamond ring that she had gotten from Tim with a cheap gold, looked like he got out of the gumball machine, ring with 2 dolphins on it and a little gemstone in the middle. This is all that George could afford, and Julie said she was fine with it. She didn't need an expensive ring because they were in love. And maybe it's true. It's just a superficial thing. It's just a material thing. But I thought, wow, the point is she is making a lot of concessions to be with this man. It's just adding another one, that's all. Tim ends up receiving a phone bill because back then he had to pay for all of your calls, especially international, and all of the faxes. This bill is in the thousands. We're talking $6,000-$7,000. And he could not believe what he was seeing. So he was like, what the F is going on here? That was when he found out the truth. That all along, Julie was cheating on him with George. I'm sure people were just waiting for Tim to snap. A person can only take so much. Tim had never cheated. He had been completely loyal this whole time. Now he just wanted to finalize this divorce so that he could move on and distance himself, so he could forget about the pain that this was causing him. Julie was preparing to try to get custody of Katie so she could take her away from Tim and go to Greece. So much so that she was trying to get a restraining order to stop Tim from getting close to their daughter. Guess who was orchestrating all this from the sidelines? George. Every move that Julie was making, he was behind it, but she might not have realized that. He drops a bomb on her. George surprises Julie and tells her he's coming to visit. She's kind of confused because he's got his job. He tells her, oh, I quit. For you, baby. I quit that job so I could spend time in New Jersey. How is he going to pay for this? Julie, of course. She told him she was so happy because at this point her stress was mounting. Her hair was falling out. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She was getting headaches. Her stomach was upset. She thought all this was because she's away from her love. Maybe it was the drugs, the obsessive working out, the lack of sleep. All these things can cause problems with stress. She goes ahead and buys George a plane ticket. She also decides to get him a wardrobe because he had to be dressed to impress all of her friends that she was going to be introducing him to. And not only that, she decided to set him up with an appointment to get a professional hairpiece transplant kind of thing. Julie was also starting to become jealous and obsessive with George. If he wouldn't call her back, she would think he was cheating. Her mind would start racing. She was so far away, she couldn't do anything. She questioned him about it, and she would tell him things like, I can't believe you would go out with a friend while I'm sitting around waiting. I've been waiting all night. I've been up, waiting for your call, waiting for your fax, and nothing. And I can't believe you're out with friends. Again, sort of this double standard. The day finally came. Friday, August 28th, George was finally in New Jersey. Julie was waiting for him right at the gate of the airport. Julie's mother wasn't very happy about this because she was still married to Tim. And Julia was the person that's been by her side through all of this. Julia was on the outside, so she could look into the relationship that Julie had with George, and she was convinced that George was a gold digger. He just wanted Julie's money, and he wanted to manipulate her to get things from her. Why else would he quit his job if he wanted to move up the ladder? If he was so ambitious, like Julie said, this doesn't match up. She would listen to George, hear his conversations. He was intelligent. He was clever. He knew exactly what to say. And Julie was in a vulnerable position, and her mother thought he was preying on her. Not only that, he wanted to steal Julie away from her family and her daughter. They would have numerous discussions about how much money Julie was going to get in the settlement. Oh, and his teeth were absolutely disgusting. They were all rotting. So Julie asked her friend Mary, who was a dentist that she went to high school with, if she would fix all of George's teeth. And of course, Mary said no. What's on her mind is George's hair transplant, his wig, whatever, and his clothes and his teeth. Eventually, he does get some kind of toupee, and Julie warns her mom, like, listen, his hair is going to look different. Don't say anything. Don't make him feel bad. So George's feelings, that was what was important. When she did introduce him to her friends or her family members, he would lie. He would say he made all this money. He was basically like a captain of a ship. It was just pathological lies. And George hated Julie's mom. They didn't even know each other very well, but it was obvious that Julia did not approve. Julia would yell at Julie because she said she was acting like a teenager. She thought it was ridiculous. Tim finally found out that George was at their house. He was furious. He told Julie, it's okay if you want to have a relationship, but what's not okay is that you're involving our daughter. Tim was getting increasingly frustrated. Julie was just charging everything to Tim's credit cards and Tim's accounts. He hadn't seen his daughter in weeks. She was keeping Katie away from him, mostly because George and Julie seemed to be in this warped, paranoid state of mind all the time, and they thought Tim was spying on them. So much so, they ripped down walls in the house, looking for evidence of recording devices. Tim had it up to his eyeballs. He decided he was going to fire Julie from the company because he wanted to separate himself as much as possible, and she wasn't even doing any work anymore, while still getting her paycheck. And at this point, he was ready. He was going to sign the settlement, so he agreed to pay Julie $600,000 just to end this mess and get over with. I think Tim was starting to go crazy because he caught wind that Julie was trying to take away Katie. Now he had enough. Now he threatened her. He said, if you don't get rid of this guy, George, and send him back to Greece, I'm not going to give you any money. And if you dare take my daughter away, I will come find you and take her back, and you will never see her again. Tim knew that he had a lot of witnesses to Julie's instability. There's no way a court was ever going to allow Julie to take Katie away to Greece, and she knew that. All of a sudden, George was gone, and everyone was shocked. They thought maybe she was finally coming to her senses. For a while, she seemed like herself again. It was a turning point in George and Julie's relationship. Maybe the finalizing of the divorce made Julie snap out of it a little bit because she started telling her friends she may be having second thoughts about George. She said that her feelings were kind of going up and down. She was starting to think this maybe wasn't a good idea. I can't believe that it would take her this long. Just a couple weeks later, though, George and Julie were back at it again. She was torn. She didn't want to lose her daughter, but she also didn't want to lose the love of her life, or who she thought was the love of her life. She kept telling Cheryl she just needed to marry him. There was no other choice. But why? On October 20th, she flies to Greece to meet up with him, to see if the feelings would still be there. Greece was beautiful. She had never lived anywhere like that. All of the feelings. She finally thinks this confirmed it. George was the right choice. The next step was meeting his parents. They were taking this long drive, and George was showing her all around, and they were discussing their plans. But all George kept emphasizing was that he couldn't wait to get the money because he had convinced her to help him open up a taxi cab business. He said it would be better than him going on the cruise ships because they would get to spend more time together. It would be like Tim and Julie having their own company together. And the settlement money was going to help them so much. To Julie, it seemed like that's all he kind of cared about. She chalked it up to him being excited. Remember, he was 22. He didn't have much life experience. George was giving her the time of her life, taking her out to dinners, going on trips to different tourist spots, buying souvenirs, and they even spent time filling out their application so that they could get married in Greece in December. By October 25th, they were flying to his hometown, and she was finally going to meet his mom. All of a sudden, George's tone just changed, and he said, "We need to have a serious conversation before you step foot in my mother's home." She was just shocked, and she was staring at him waiting, and he said very sternly, "You can never let my mom know you are married, and more importantly, you can never, ever let her know that you have a child." It turns out that his family is Greek Orthodox, and they would see this as immoral. There was a chance that they would condemn him or even disown him, which is crazy, but that's just the way it was. I thought this was crazy because I was thinking, how long could she keep that a secret? She can't keep a secret forever. This is her child. But she played it off. Everyone seemed to like her and say that she was lovely. When she returned back home, she began packing right away, packing up everything she owned, and she was having it shipped all the way to Greece. She didn't even have a place to live yet. It was definitely like putting the cart before the horse, and no one understood why in the world she would be rushing to do this. It's like she couldn't get away from her family fast enough. On November 22nd, she threw a party for little Katie. It was her 3rd birthday and everyone came, including the friends that she had pushed away. They were there for Katie. All Julie talked about was her trip to Greece and how excited she was to move. Tony had expected her to talk about how hard it was to be away from her family and Katie in the transition. But all she mentioned was that it was really hard because she couldn't find anywhere to get her nails done. Tony just felt sick to his stomach. Julie was set. She was planning to move December 6th. Tim would take ownership of their house, and he was already starting to move things back in. He noticed on the day she was leaving that she was heavily intoxicated. He came by and she was just taking shot after shot. It wasn't his business or his problem anymore, but he couldn't help feeling bad for her. Tim still loved her, even if Julie was a mess. Perhaps she thought, if I'm wasted, it's going to be easier to say goodbye. But Tim kept telling her, just rip the Band-Aid off. Say goodbye and leave, or you're going to miss your flight. Julie's friend Sue drove her off to the airport and said goodbye. Julie was finally free. She arrived in Greece on December 8th, but she was shocked when she arrived. She could not believe how bad the weather was. In October, when she came to visit, it was sunny, it was beautiful. They spent time on the beach, and now it was cold. Absolutely dreadful. A ton of snow was on the ground, and even though it could be pretty to some people, this is not what she was expecting. But once she saw George, her world felt sunny again. They didn't have a place of their own yet. They'd be staying with George's mother. It really was like they were teenagers again. They had a lot to do. They needed a marriage license, an apartment. They were planning a wedding. It was overwhelming, but it was also really exciting. First on that list was getting a bank account to deposit the first portion of her settlement funds. They decided it would be best if they got a joint bank account since Julie didn't speak the language. She would need George to assist her with that. Plus, they were about to be husband and wife, so they deposited $80,000 into the joint account and kept $18,000 in cash. They were living the life. They were looking for apartments during the day, and then they were partying all night at a different hotel and bar. Time was just flying by, and before they knew it, it was Christmas time. The good thing was, Julie was still in touch with all of her friends and her mom and Katie. She tried calling Katie on Christmas Eve, but she had been drinking and she forgot about the time difference. She had to wait till the next day, but she was very anxious. And when she did call, she told Katie that she missed her. She wished she could see the beautiful town of Kavala. Sunday, January 3rd, 1999, Julie turned 31, and they had a big party to celebrate. They were now living in a luxury hotel until they finalized the lease on their apartment. It was one of the most expensive hotels in the area, called Ignatia Hotel. And luckily, just a week later, they were finally moved in to their new apartment. It was in the most expensive area in Kavala. They prepaid the rent in cash for an entire year. On Friday, January 8th, Julie and George went to pick up their marriage license. They planned to get married on January 23rd. Everything seemed to be falling into place. Next stop, Athens, to pick up all of Julie's belongings they had finally shipped from New Jersey. It was a 6-hour drive, but they were excited. Not only that, this was the only location the items could be shipped to, and that was okay. George wanted to show her how beautiful the country was. His grandmother and his father lived there, so they would have a place to stay at his grandmother's house. They were getting kind of a late start due to some bad news. George's brother was sick, and they had to meet his mom at the hospital. They did their very best to console his mom, but they knew they had to go. They didn't want to miss their appointment to pick up their rental car. They chose a white Fiat Punto, and by 5 p.m., they began their drive to Athens. George figured they would stop on the way if the weather got real bad or they got hungry. Back in New Jersey, everyone's life is carrying on as usual, except when Sue gets a call on Monday morning, January 11th. Sue was busy rushing around, getting her son ready for school, when her home phone started ringing. She picked up, and she heard a breathless, panicked voice on the other end. At first, she had no idea who this was. It was very hard for her to understand them, and the connection was terrible. Finally, she could make out the words, "I can't find her, I can't find her." It was George. Sue wasn't worried. She knew Julie. Julie was spontaneous. She told George to calm down, explain exactly what was going on. He told her about their drive to get Julie's things, his grandmother's, their plans, everything. She had spoken to Julie not too long ago, and Julie was not in a good mood. But she was used to that. That was the way she was. She could get upset at the drop of a hat. She asked George if they had an argument or anything, and he said no. What Sue gathered from this conversation with George was that George and Julie made it to Athens on Friday night. They laid low on Saturday because they were tired after a long trip. On Sunday night, they took a trip to, I hope I'm saying this right, to Omonia Square in downtown Athens. It's very similar to New York's Times Square. It's known as the heart of Athens. It's a very busy area full of shops, bars, clubs, restaurants. It's really easy to get lost in a crowd. Julie was in a foreign country. She did not speak the language. She could easily lose her bearings. But on the other hand, she was very independent and somewhat stubborn. George said they had been walking around sightseeing for a while and got hungry. He wanted to call his grandma to let her know they would be out late. They'd grab a bite to eat and then head to the bars. Julie didn't want to waste any money on food, so she was just going to grab some McDonald's and then they were going to make their way out to enjoy the nightlife. The last thing he remembers was seeing her walking towards McDonald's on a dark, crowded street. She was supposed to meet him back at the payphone, but she never did. He waited there a few minutes and then started to get worried, so he made his way back to McDonald's. She wasn't there. He said he got scared. He didn't know what to do, so he called his grandmother back to tell her what had happened. Then he rang his mother, asking if she had heard from Julie, and she said no. He calls his father, Pavlov. He lived nearby, and he told him what was going on, and he rushed over to help George look for her. After a while, they realized their efforts were in vain, so they went to the police station and they reported Julie missing. George told Sue they didn't even seem to care. They told him it was common for people to get lost there and that she would be fine. She would probably make her way to the police department soon and ask them for help. But George and his father did not give up. They walked around frantically, with George in tears for hours, going to each and every establishment with a picture of Julie in their hands asking, "Have you seen her?" George told Sue what Julie was wearing: a black dress, high heels, and her hair was in a ponytail. Sue had suspected Julie had left George because on their last phone call, Julie told Sue she missed Katie so much. She was having trouble with the language barrier. She couldn't read the newspaper. She didn't understand the street signs, anything. She was actually calling pretty frequently. Even told Sue she called Katie every day. She seemed homesick, which was completely normal, so she said that maybe Julie should take a break. He told Sue she had about $200 in cash and her credit cards on her, but then he said something that really concerned her. He said that he found her passport in the car. He also explained that a cop had told him that he saw Julie, but now he couldn't find the cop and he didn't know what to do. He couldn't even get into their apartment if he drove back home because the key was missing and he said he thought Julie might have it. Sue hung up and she immediately called Tim. When he heard that Julie had gone missing, he told Sue she was probably on her way back to the US until he found out about the passport. That was completely out of character for Julie. She would never mess that up. At this point, they're calling all of Julie's friends to find out if anyone had heard from her. Meanwhile, George tells Sue he's going to head to the American Embassy. Tracy had some interesting information about the last time she spoke to Julie. On January 6th, just 2 days before their trip to Athens, Julie called Tracy distraught. She was hyperventilating. Tracy couldn't understand her. She was drunk. So Tracy wasn't sure what to think. But she said Julie wanted to come home. She missed Katie way too much. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. Tracy says, just come back. If you're feeling that way, just come home. But through tears, Julie said she couldn't. It would be too embarrassing. She made this choice. Her friends would think she's crazy. Tim had the house. Where was she going to go? Julie said she had to be strong and just work it out. Tracy told Julie not to be ridiculous. She could come live with her just for a little while, maybe just come back and visit and decide what to do next. Tracy even got on the phone with George. He was saying the same thing. He was trying to console Julie, but she told George no. George told Tracy they found out there was no way for him to get out of his military service, so she would most likely have to come back to the US anyway, anytime he was away. After the phone call, Tracy began making arrangements for Julie to come back, which included her staying at Tracy's. She was keeping it to herself until she could work things out. She said the only person who knew was Julia. She called to let her know the good news. Julie was coming back, but Julia was pissed. She could never put the past behind her. She wouldn't forgive Julie for leaving Katie behind. Now Tim lets Tracy know that Julia ran it by him. He didn't take it seriously though, but he did think it was a bad idea for her to be coming in and out of Katie's life. She was just beginning to adjust to life without Julie there. That night, Julie also tried to call her mother, but Julia didn't want to talk to her, so she handed the phone to Tim. Tim told Julie it was a terrible idea for her to be coming back and forth right now. So at that point, Julie had no choice but to agree. Later, Tim remembers hearing the phone ringing, but he was busy. He was getting into the shower, so he never picked it up. This was the last time anyone from the United States talked to Julie, as far as they knew. So what happened? When Tony was informed about Julie's disappearance, he admitted that Julie had called him on October 7th while George was visiting. She said George was in jail in New Jersey. She was desperately begging Tony to post his bail, which he refused to do. Julie said Julia had accused George of strangling her and that Tim was conspiring against George to have him arrested. Tony wasn't so sure that was exactly how the story went, but he told everyone that that was the real reason George went back to Greece. It wasn't on his own volition. It was an agreement with the prosecutor, and Tim had pushed for it. He didn't want George around Katie after what happened. It was time to talk to Julia and Tim. As it turns out, Julia had a different story. She said she had had enough of George. She told him he was pathetic. Living in Julie's house, grow the F up. This infuriated George to the point where he was yelling in Julia's face, and then he grabbed her and he pushed her against the wall, and he wasn't stopping. She was gasping for breath, trying her hardest to pull away from this man, and if Julie hadn't come into the room at that time, she probably would have died. Julie is trying to pull him off of her mother, but he wouldn't stop. She finally tells him, if you don't stop, you're going to go to jail. We're not going to be able to be together. And that's when he let go. Julia didn't wait a second. She ran to the phone and she called 911. The police came and arrested George and threw him in jail. That is when Julie reached out to Tony, and he refused to help. Tim jumped in to save Julie and his daughter from a maniac. He begged the prosecutor to make a deal. If Julia agreed to drop the charges, they would deport him back to Greece with no opportunity for him to stop at their house. He had to immediately get on a plane and leave, and that's exactly what he did. Julie was frantically trying to make a different plan. She calls Tony and says, "Hey, can George hide and stay at your place?" That's insane. He pretty much says, no. And when he did, Julie gave him a big F you and hung up on him. I can't believe Julie was willing to take the blame for everything that happened. She jumps on a plane to Greece and follows George, saying that it was her that strangled her mother, not George, that Julia hated him. She just didn't want Julie to be happy. So she made a false report, and it was George that pulled Julie off of her mother. She made George out to look like the person who rescued Julia. Who would you believe? Let's jump back to the present. Later that same day, Sue gets another call from George. He had this fear in his voice, and he tells her the truth. Him and Julie had been arguing before she went missing. Things were starting to sound pretty frightening, and Tracy and Sue decided they were going to team up and do whatever it took to find Julie. The plan was to have Sue continue to talk to George, pretend like she cared about him, hoping she could coax him to give her more information. Tracy's job was to connect with the American embassy in Greece. She was calling hospitals all around Athens, and an operator at the embassy corroborated that George had actually called, come in, and reported Julie missing. It was really difficult. There wasn't anyone who spoke English at the police station in Greece, and it didn't seem like the Greek authorities cared. However, Tracy found someone in the U.S. that was willing to translate for them, and on Wednesday, George called to update Sue. It was hard for Julie's friends not to believe that George was involved, and when he called on Wednesday to update them, Sue tried to convince him that the search was getting really serious in the U.S. She said that the FBI was involved, and his tone changed. But as soon as it changed, it went right back to him being grateful and said he was glad that they were doing all that for Julie. But the next thing raised a big red flag. George tells Tracy and Sue he no longer has Julie's passport because thieves took it. Right. Okay, so her passport just gets stolen. Every possible theory was being explored by Julie's friends and family. Was it human trafficking? Had George sold her into slavery? Was she kidnapped? Had she tried to run off somewhere and gotten lost? Was she out looking for drugs and met the wrong people? What happened? A week has gone by. They were more worried than ever, and George seemed to be in this frantic state of mind. He started questioning them, asking them, what specific conversations did you have with Julie when she called you last? I didn't think that was unusual, because I'd want to know that too. 2 weeks after George had reported Julie missing, guess where he was? At the bank. And guess what he was trying to do? Get Julie's money out. But the check hadn't cleared, and this made George very angry. He yelled in the teller's face, and he left the building in a huff. On January 23rd, which was supposed to be the day that Julie and George got married, Julie's family put out a press release. News stations were beginning to run the story. The Trentonian gets involved. They had recently interviewed Julie for a new segment called What Are They Doing Now? The reporter who had done the interview thought there were gaps in the story, and he wanted to interview Julie's family and friends. He wrote an entire report that appeared on the front page of the newspaper. This is one of their own. They wanted to do everything they could to help her. The story was reaching news outlets in Greece, and this set George off. He started bombarding Sue, calling and screaming in her ear, asking why they were trying to pin this on him, that he was not guilty. Now the Greek authorities were finally doing something. George went on TV telling the same story he had told everybody else, but Julie's family noticed something. He wasn't referring to her by name. He just kept calling her the woman. Who does that? However, he's still cooperating with police. Tim finally told reporters about George's arrest in New Jersey a few months earlier. They interviewed Julia to corroborate the details. Things were really starting to heat up, but time was not on their side. 16 days had gone by since Julie was reported missing. The Greek police took George into an interrogation room, and their chief inspector started to interrogate George. He just stuck to the same story, but it's very hard to outsmart experienced law enforcement agents. After 4 long hours, George confessed that he killed Julie. He insisted it was in the heat of the moment, that he loved Julie so much. This was not what he intended. Things just got out of control. He was crying, and he was very believable, but it didn't matter because he confessed. Julie was dead. They wanted all the details, and they wanted them now. In a taped confession, George admitted that Julie had never gone missing. He had lied to everyone, even himself. He was even starting to believe, in some delusional state of mind, that he hadn't done this. But he did. He told the chief inspector the entire story about how they met, how they fell in love, that he felt awful that she cheated on Tim, but the passion for each other was too strong to avoid. He felt even worse that she was willing to leave Katie behind, but it's what Julie wanted, that she told him she needed to escape from Tim. That made George feel better, but George told the inspector he did not want to be the reason Julie left him, but he felt he was. He said that their relationship was perfect, but he conveniently left out the fact that he strangled Julie's mother. Friends suspected all along that he probably did the same thing to Julie. George went on to admit Julie wasn't happy once she moved to Greece. She began to complain about everything. She called the Greeks lazy, with bad attitudes and not friendly. She was bored. There was nothing to do in the towns, and they were nothing like she expected. The beauty of the city was outweighed by her inability to communicate and make friends and indulge in the things that she loved the most about her home. She was homesick. He said he tried to be supportive, but Julie would oscillate between wanting to leave and saying that she was fine and she was going to learn to live a different lifestyle for him. George even mentioned the truth that he talked to Tracy and told her it would be best for Julie to come back home. She just wasn't ready yet. He went on to say he knew it was best if she just left him, but it was too complicated. She had her child back home. His parents would not have agreed with all of it. The passion was wearing off, and he wanted her to be happy. So he was thinking, I'm going to force her hand. And that's when he says he figured if she started to hate him, she would finally go back. They were going to have to be away from each other for 2 years anyway. He had to serve in the military. So in that time apart, maybe they would find out that they truly wanted to be together, or they didn't. He told the inspector that it was his plan to become physical with her, hoping she would get the point. He said he knew Julie would never stand for it. If he hurt her, she was sure to leave. He wasn't planning on seriously injuring her. The inspector called bullshit, even though George was hysterically crying. Then he admitted what he did to poor Julie, the woman that loved him and left behind her entire life to take her chance on this young Greek sailor. What you're about to hear was no accident. Investigators knew that part was a lie. They suspected Julie was slipping out of George's grasp. She wanted to leave him. They had enough experience to know George was just trying to cover his ass and act like he wasn't a violent man, a monster, overcome with jealousy and rage, who couldn't bear losing a woman he never deserved to begin with. If he couldn't have her, no one else would. The truth is that Julie began calling her daughter Katie nonstop for weeks. Every day, sometimes multiple times a day. She would cry and cry. George told the truth. She started complaining about everything. She complained to friends that she just wasn't used to this. She felt like she was slumming it. Then George admitted that his mother found out about Julie's daughter, and she was disgusted that a mother would leave her child behind like that. She confronted both Julie and George. That is why they moved into the hotel. His mother kicked them out. Julie knew she wanted to leave. She just talked crap about Greece, saying it's not even comparable to America. On December 8th, a family member had to pry George's hands off of Julie's neck. George had had enough. He grabbed Julie during one of their arguments, and he began cutting off her airway, just gripping her neck tighter and tighter until someone had to pull him off. Julie was shocked. It was in that moment she started to realize that she could be in real danger. She tried to run and find a police station to press charges, but George's family stopped her. They tried to convince her it was out of character for him. He just wanted her to love Greece and be happy. They said they knew he wasn't going to hurt her, but didn't he just hurt her? After this incident, they got kicked out of their hotel because other occupants complained about all the yelling. One of the maids came forward and said that they had been arguing nonstop for days. They went to stay at another hotel. That's when George caught Julie trying to call home and tell her friends what happened. He would grab the phone and slam it down each time. Julie had realized by now they really didn't have that much in common. She had never had anyone become physical like that with her. George started to get obsessed and paranoid that she was trying to figure out how to escape. The day they were planning on picking up her things, she told George as soon as they got there, she was going to send her things right back to New Jersey. Meanwhile, George's family members were being questioned as well, and things that no one knew came to the surface. As it turns out, he was known to go into a fit of rage and become violent. People noticed he was very unstable. His mom had schizophrenia, and she had spent time in mental hospitals. George definitely had issues. He was narcissistic. He thought he was better than everyone else, and he was very arrogant. But he was a good actor, and that's the thing. Everything was an act. He saw Julie as a possession. He was only trying to get what he could out of her, possibly her money. They couldn't get into George's mind, but this is what they suspected. When George's dad cheated on his mother, he got so violent, he stabbed him in the neck with a kitchen knife, then kicked him down their stairs. His dad had to be in the hospital for several weeks. George spent time locked up in an institution for the clinically insane. They thought maybe he was suffering from schizophrenia like his mom. It was when he got out of the institution that his family sent him to a trade school. They were hoping they could find something that would put him on a better path. He was medicated at the time, but he had stopped taking his pills. He said they were no good, and he was against them. It's sad that his family would keep this from Julie. Do you think as parents they had an obligation to let her know the truth? Why would you protect him? George's family wasn't the only one with new information. Sue had some as well. She said that when Julie flew back to New Jersey on November 8th, there were stitches on her arm. Julie swore it was because her hand accidentally went through a window, but Sue had a feeling she was lying. She told her, please take care of yourself, and at the very least, take some of your money and keep it in a bank account in New Jersey. George called her in the middle of this conversation, and to Sue's surprise, she heard Julie telling George about her plan to leave some money in the U.S. He goes ballistic, accuses her of being selfish. On January 8th, the couple were making that long drive to Athens in the dark on a desolate 2-lane highway. They weren't really talking to each other, and once they did, they got into yet another argument. They were in such close quarters. They're in a car. They can't cool off. They can't walk away. It was not a good situation. We can only speculate exactly what was going through George's mind, but the investigators are probably right, because all of a sudden, George stopped the car. He told Julie he had to relieve himself, but that's not what happened. They were in the middle of nowhere, and George knew this area really well. He knew no one would see them. No one would hear them. No one could help Julie, no matter how loud she screamed. He parked the car, turned off the engine. Then he looked over at Julie. He said she must have known that something was going to happen because he could tell she was scared. He locked the doors, and without warning, he reached out and grabbed her throat, and he squeezed as hard as he could. He said Julie began to scream. She was trying to defend herself, and he just wanted to shut her up, so he squeezed harder. He said he wasn't in his right mind. It's like he was outside of his body and he couldn't control what he was doing. She kept yelling and saying, "What are you trying to do?" He just squeezed harder and harder for what seemed like a few seconds, but it had to be at least 3 whole minutes, because that's typically how long it would take someone to become unconscious or to take their life. It was in that moment he realized that he had crushed her neck. He could tell there was nothing left in her. Her body just slid down in the seat. George said he thought he was dreaming. He couldn't believe what he had just done. The first thing that came to his mind was getting rid of her, and he would end his life as well. He thought he would honor their relationship. They met at sea, so to the sea she would go. He would set her body ablaze and then throw her ashes into the water, then jump off a cliff to join her forever. That's not what happened. We know, because he's here and Julie isn't. He's a coward. He told investigators that he attempted to take his life 3 separate times. A BB gun to the neck, jumping in front of a truck, and an overdose. And he insists none of them worked. I guess you didn't try hard enough. That was mean, but... He tossed her into the trunk, drove to a gas station and bought a canister of gasoline, then drove back close to where he had ended her life, and that's where he tried to set her on fire. By 2 lakes in a secluded area, he removed her from the trunk, dragged her near the lakes, and proceeded to douse her in gasoline. He didn't hesitate to set her on fire. He sat there and watched as her clothes went up in flames. He stared at her as the flames began to consume her corpse. But it was raining, so she wasn't burning. The fire wouldn't stay lit no matter what he did, so he just kept pouring gasoline over her, and she refused to burn. At that point, he thought maybe he should just stop and throw her in the lake instead, but he panicked and threw her back in the trunk. He raced to his grandmother's house, and luckily she wasn't home. He grabbed a big suitcase and drove right back to the lakes. It was midnight, and George no longer saw Julie as a human being. She was just something he needed to discard of. Rigor mortis hadn't completely set in, so he could move her limbs, though they were charred from the thighs up. There was a problem. He could not get her entire body to fit in a rigid plastic suitcase. Her head kept sticking out. He sat there thinking of a solution. How was he going to get rid of her? He had to get rid of the head. It's disgusting. This is a little girl's mom. She's a friend. She's a beautiful person. No matter what mistakes people think she made, no one like Julie deserves something like this. Some people may say people like George deserve this. Evil people, not Julie. He knew there was an iron saw or a hacksaw at his grandmother's house, so he dragged her back to the car and threw her into the trunk once again. Goes all the way back to his grandmother's, gets the saw, and drives back to the lake. It's close to 3 o'clock in the morning when he removes her once again, places her on a garbage bag, and proceeds to get to work on her head. He penetrated where the neck meets the collarbone. Once he was finished, he looked down to see that he was covered in head to toe with blood. I wonder if he washed himself in the lake, but he had finally completed his mission. But this next part is what I question the most, and it's the part that haunts me. This sicko picks up her head by her hair to look at her face to face for one last time. His face was the last face that Julie saw before her life was stolen from her. And the same face was the last face to stare back at her blank eyes. Even after all the things that George had just done to her, he said that she still looked gorgeous. He just looked at her, not realizing this could be real. But when he looked at her face, he could see that last look on her face. The horror just stuck, and he knew what he did. George was not going to release Julie and let her rest until his lips met hers one last time. And while he was still holding her by the hair, he kissed her. This absolutely grossed me out. Her body was finally able to fit inside the suitcase. Once he stuffed it in, he threw it into the lake, and he stared at it as it disappeared under the water. George had to make sure that he was the last person that could look at Julie's beautiful face. He didn't throw that in the lake. He set it down and he burned it until only a charred ball was left. He tossed what was left of her inside the trunk and drove back to Kavala. He said one last goodbye to her before tossing her head into the sea. All that other stuff was a lie, and he didn't report Julie missing until a couple days had already passed. He drove all the way back to Kavala and stayed holed up in their apartment. And then he made the 400-mile trek back to Athens just to set up his alibi. Julie never got to see the pretty lights of Ammonia Square. I want to go back to the present again because we're almost done here. Tim was notified of George's confession that evening, and he did not want Julie's mom to know. He needed to find out what the hell was happening, and it was so hard being so far away. The news would get out soon enough, and there was no way that this horrendous act was going to be a secret for long. Tim had to tell Julie's friends before they read the horrific, and I mean horrific headlines. But Julia had known all along that Julie was dead. And when Tim began to tell her, she screamed he killed her. She told Tim that she had warned Julie, but Julie just said she was paranoid. 19 days. A whole 19 days had passed as Julie's body laid hidden beneath the murky water of that lake. George agreed to lead authorities to where she was, and it took divers 2 hours to locate the suitcase containing her remains below 5 feet of water. I'm not going to tell you what they found. When they opened that suitcase, you can use your own imagination, but it shocked even the most seasoned detectives. George was immediately taken into custody, and Julie's family was notified of the discovery. Julia heard the devastating news on TV, and she was in complete disbelief. Julia asked how someone could do that. He was supposed to love her. What kind of love is that? They had to do whatever it took to shield Katie. She couldn't know. Her innocence would be robbed from her. She was only 3. There was no way she would be able to understand. So they had to be strong and keep things quiet at home, but it was really hard because the media gathered right outside their house day and night. Julie's friends and family got together so that they could console one another, and they were praying that they could locate her head. Tim was the one who made the trip to Greece to bring Julie's body back home and lay her to rest while George was being arraigned. He confessed out loud to reporters that he regretted what he'd done. His father hires an attorney to defend him. Why? Would you do that for your child if this is what they had done? His mother and his grandmother had a different reaction. His mom had a stroke, devastated for Julie and her family, and his grandmother was shocked. She said that it looked like they had a perfect relationship, and she was so sorry for Julie's family. And another relative reported that George's father had to be medicated because he was such a mess, but he wanted to express his condolences and how sorry he was, and he wished his son was dead instead of Julie, that she was innocent, and she did not deserve this, and he was so very sorry. The Greek prosecutor charged George with 3 offenses: premeditated murder, desecration of a body, and evading police. The medical examiner said that they could not determine an actual cause of death. There was no way to examine the neck, so they didn't know whether she was strangled or if George had done something way worse. And when I told you that there were horrific headlines, there was all kinds of news about Julie's death, but some of the newspaper articles that I found hurt to read. To me, these headlines dehumanize Julie. They dehumanize these poor victims. And I would hate to know that Katie would read these later in life, or could read these later in life. And the Greek press, they were already painting Julie in a negative light. All they did was show videos of her in her bikini. The Greek authorities said that this was the worst murder that had ever occurred in their entire country. But way worse were the public. The court of public opinion came down hard on Julie. They were blaming her for her own death, even stooping so low and saying things like, if you play with fire, you're going to get burned. They painted her as a bad mother, not able to forgive her for leaving Katie behind. Look, I may not agree with what Julie did, but I am not Julie. Julie was not well. We know that. We don't have to be professionals to see the signs. They were there. She was abusing substances, not taking her prescription medication, and being completely manipulated by a sociopath. Let's not judge her unless we have been in her situation. And even then, take a moment to realize that we are all imperfect, and it doesn't downplay, or worse, it doesn't justify what George did in any way. As I said, Katie was 3, and she was beginning to ask about Julie. She had been speaking to her frequently, and now it stopped. The family had no idea what they should do, and that's hard. I don't think at 3 she would be able to understand, but I hate to lie to someone, especially someone's child. And yet on the other hand, if it were me, maybe I would say, Mommy went away, but she loves you so much, and one day you'll know the whole story. What would you do? And they were about to make an insanity plea, but George said he wanted to die, which was completely pointless because Greece didn't have a death penalty. By February 22nd, the Greek authorities had released Julie's body to Tim, but he never got the chance to confront George, and that was okay, because the most important thing was getting Julie back home. The day of Julie's funeral, Tim decided it was time to let Katie know that she would never be seeing her mom again. This was the hardest for me to read. It was devastatingly sad. I kind of couldn't believe what I read when I read this, but I told you I would find it really hard to lie. Tim told her, "Your mommy is not coming back because she's dead." And that sounds harsh to me, but it had to be done. I think he had to have that closure. It's hard for me to keep it together. I don't know how he did this. And he said that Katie cried, and she cried and fell into his arms. She didn't completely understand death, but she understood the concept. That's one of the saddest things that I've had to read, and I'm not telling you all the details. There's so much more. But what Julie's friends didn't want is Katie to grow up only knowing the bad things that happened to her mother. So they started a journal for her, and they asked everyone who knew Julie to write things they loved about her, things that they knew, memories that they could share, and they gave that to Tim to give to Katie. Tim was the source of strength for everyone. He cared for Julie more than anyone, all the way until the end. Never one complaint coming out of his mouth. And when he was questioned about what he did, he said, "It would be easy for me to say, she left me for some other guy and I'm out of here. But I have a daughter, and she's looking to me to do the right thing." I always like to tell you what happened with the trial. What was the outcome? George's trial started on Saturday, November 27th in 1999. The legal system in Greece is much different than it is in America. There's a 3-judge panel that hears all the evidence after reading the written arguments that come from both sides. It's not a jury of your peers, so the trials only last a couple days. The insanity defense was taken off the table, and Tim traveled all the way to Greece so that he could be at the trial in person. The prosecutors argued that the evidence showed George's plan to get rid of Julie in order to steal her settlement funds. George might have been chained to his seat, but he did not sit there quietly. He made angry outbursts during the prosecutor's arguments. Tim actually got on the stand and told the court that Julie was not just a model, not just a woman who wore a bikini. She was his love and his friend, and he wants George to go to jail for the rest of his life. George even decided to testify, which lasted around 5 hours. And it was on the last day of trial, still making outbursts during closing arguments as well. This man was seriously unstable. And it was on Monday, December 6th, which coincidentally was the year anniversary of Julie's move from the U.S. to Greece, that George was found guilty on all 3 charges and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Now I'm going to give you some bad news. The family thought that George would never see the light of day again and never be able to hurt another person. However, just 3 years after he was sentenced, on October 8th, 2002, George appealed. He said that what he did was not premeditated. It was in a jealous rage after Julie told him she was going to leave. He pleaded to the court saying, "I was in a haze when she said she was going to leave me. I had planned my life with her. It was in a moment of intense passion." And the court believed him. They said they could see that he was remorseful. He had no prior convictions. And after just 1 day of trial, they ended up reducing his sentence to only 23 years. And not only that, because he won the appeal, it opened the door for George to apply for early release. After all of this, in the disgusting way that he carried out this crime, George was released in 2007. He's remarried now, and he's living with his new family in Kavala. I can't believe that. It finally seemed that there was going to be closure, even though there really is no closure when someone we love is taken from this world so soon, and in the way that Julie had been. And as far as I could tell, they never were able to officially confirm finding Julie's skull. In 2001, a partial skull was recovered in the sea near the site where she was killed. The coroner said it appeared to be consistent with a skull that had been submerged for 3 years, but they could not use the teeth for dental identification. A Greek tourist had actually found the skull on September 2nd, and it was floating about 100 feet from shore. At the end of the day, we are all human. We want the same things. We want love and happiness and a long life. Julie had 2 of those things, and chasing both of them robbed her of the life she could have had if it wasn't for a manipulative monster who convinced her that the grass was greener on his side of the world. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did that. But first, I just want to thank you once again for watching. I really appreciate it.